Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. This video is a album review on the latest Grayscale album that just was released this week. It's by an artist named BT Gate X-138, and the album title is called Gravitational Grooves. And this is the third time the artist has been featured on Grayscale. Back in 2022, they first had their first appearance with a single called Bolide. And then in 2023, they also had a full-length album called KV Pylon. So this is their second album on the label. The artist has been featured on a lot of really strong dub techno labels like Hello Strange, Apnea, Space of Variance. I first got wind of them in probably about 8 years ago or so on the Tenophonica label as well, which is a really strong dub techno label. So this artist is definitely an up and coming producer and getting a lot of respect and well deserved because of what I've heard so far from the artist. So I'm excited to check out this new album. There's 10 tracks on there. So we'll get a chance to listen to some of the tracks, and I'll give my thoughts about each track and a score, and then an overall score of the album. And yeah, we'll enjoy some new dub techno from this up and coming artist named BT Gate X138. So yeah, let's check out the first track, and it's called Inertia, and it comes from the album called Gravitational Grooves. So that was track number one called Inertia. Uh, gotta love the really strong production, first of all, on this. I really like the gentle chords. There's definitely a more of a tie to this track in dub than full on techno. And because of that laid back vibe and that hazy audio kind of interference that looms over the track, it's really a nice balance. But it's definitely on the more laid back and mellow side, easy on the ears, just relaxing, drifting, hypnotizing. Also, nice classic sound. Really strong opening track, and I give it a 7.5 out of 10 for a very good rating and a very good start to the album. Really like this track called Inertia. And let's go on to track number 2 called Gravity. Track number 2 called Gravity. During my days doing reviews and checking out new music online, I get a chance to listen to a lot of new techno music. And one of the things that I find that a lot of the newer techno producers can't do as well, in my opinion, is create a hook inside of techno music. I think this is a great example of how to make your track catchy and how to make it addictive in a minimal way. And a lot of times you have to have a sound that sort of balances off another sound. There's a lot of times I feel like a lot of these producers in techno these days is they're making sounds and they're really focused on the evolution of the track, which is fine, and that's certainly important because, in fact, that's one of the most important things is how a track flows. And sometimes maybe one of the other things in techno that is probably a little bit too focused on is the actual sounds themselves. I feel like a lot of producers these days, they focus on the sounds and overly, I wouldn't say overly produce them, but they're so focused on the sounds that they're not really necessarily focused on how the sounds work with the other sounds in the song. And this is a great example. And in my opinion, it's really important about the evolution of techno and what made techno so great is the catchiness between sounds. Like you can hear sounds in this track where chords are sort of bouncing off each other, and then one will sort of fade out. It'll kind of come back. One will come back, and then the hook will come back with the other one. You can kind of hear it with the chords if you hear the whole track. Fades out, comes back, and just by doing those particular things bouncing off each other, it becomes very addictive, and that's even without even mentioning any of the other very well produced things that are going on in this track. But you have certain sounds that are bouncing off each other to make the sound very catchy and almost trance inducing and really makes the track deep. It's just so important and such a great strategy in techno. And I feel like a lot of the producers these days, they focus on the sounds, they focus on the evolution, but they don't focus on the tracks and how the sounds work together. Like it's almost like is if you could just do a beat and listen to your own production for 5 minutes and just make sure that you're absolutely okay with that and listen to it for a couple days or so. Does it start to become catchier and catchier and catchier? Just the basis of the song. Just like that would be a start for a lot of these producers nowadays. He nails it. I mean, it's just a great example of how to make a hook out of a track. It doesn't need to be overproduced. Focus on the details for sure. Focus on the sounds for sure, but make sure that your song is catchy and addictive. And there's subtle changes in here. Things come and go, and it's just very minor changes, but it just works so perfectly. Love the deep listening of this track. Very catchy, melodic track. The underlying tone is consistent, and that's gives it sort of this ambient dub vibe as well. This track is definitely kind of more laid back, but it's not laid back as the first track. But it's because that tone's kind of in the middle there. It just allows the artist to really have sounds below and above that sound, and it really kind of give it a really nice spaciousness, even though there's a consistent tone going through it. You would think a lot of times with a consistent tone through it, it would almost be off-putting to everything else, but you almost don't even notice it because you're focused in on other things. And that's a great thing about techno music like this is you can tune out certain things, you can focus on other things. There's so much to to get lost in and to focus on this track. It really teaches you how to listen intentively or have selective hearing. Like it really teaches you how to focus in and get lost in certain sounds that you like and sort of understand and appreciate the evolution of the track. Just a very well produced track. It is still kind of laid back. I do like Inertia a little bit better, but this is definitely a grower, and this is the type of track that will get better and better with more listens. And still, I find it a very good track. I give it a 7 out of 10. So some nice consistency going on with the album right now. Nice, good mellow flow, which I like. And yeah, let's go on to track number 3 called Orbit. that was track number three called Orbit. The beat is a little heavier on this one, and then it kind of turns a little bit bouncy as the track goes. I really like the airy, light, airy haze in the upper atmosphere, and the chords are just beautiful. It both those give it really gives the track a really nice, spacious and inviting room for everything else to breathe in, and there's a lot of opportunity in the mid range, and it gets filled in with a lot of nice creative delays and echoes within the chords. The rising chords are beautiful. Love the layering melodies. This track has a touch of a house feel, a touch of a house atmosphere in there, but just beautiful attention to detail on this track, and really well produced, really strong stuff. I give this Orbit a score of 7.5 stars. Another one that could be going on its way to towards an 8 and becoming a classic over. Sometimes it takes tracks like this, maybe not only quite a few listens, but um, it could take years for it to really continue to build a a memory and a lasting impression on yourself. It's interesting with dub techno. I find that I can I feel like I'm pretty advanced and or pretty experienced enough listening to dub techno. I've been listening to dub techno for maybe almost 30 years now, and I've been really into dub and traditional dub music for a good 25 years as well, as far as like Jamaican, everything from the Scientist to King Tubby to you know all kinds of stuff. So I feel like I'm pretty versed in dub techno and dub music, and when I hear a track, I feel like I can give uh, a pretty good first impression whether I like the track or not. I can tell the production even maybe even quicker than that, but I know. But I feel like I can get an idea if I really like the track or not, and where I would score the track if I was to give it a score. uh, Within the first couple tracks, but there is sometimes tracks that I do feel, and I like to mention it when they do because they do can over time take on a life of their own and sort of continue to sort of become a better score if as the more times I listen to it. But not a lot with dub techno. In fact, I'd probably say less so in dub techno, even though it's a deeper style of techno. Um, I feel like on certain styles of dub techno, certain productions, like especially this style when it's more laid back, like it grows on you over time, and it can continue to even get better and more recognizable and more liked. And when you come back to it, it becomes more familiar. And so there is a lot of that in certain styles of dub techno. But for the most part, I feel like I can give it a score real quick, and if I can find out and feel really quickly whether I really like the track or I think it's okay or maybe it's subpar. But with this style of dub techno that's in this album so far, all of these tracks so far, and ones I've heard in the past from this artist, they're the type that can grow on you. And so even though I give this track a 7.5, which is a very strong score in my opinion, it's very rare that a song will get an 8 from me and above on the first listen. Um, I won't say never because certainly never. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a track on here that gets an 8. But there's some times where tracks will become better with the more listens. It's kind of obvious, and I don't know why I'm explaining it, but it's just certain dub techno makes me feel like the more times I listen to it and revisit it, it can grow on you a little bit more so than other styles. But that's only with the more deeper, well produced dub techno like this. It's kind of subliminal in a way like that because it does kind of lend itself to become better as you keep listening to it, and the more time you spend on it, the more enveloped and the more you get lost in the music and the songs become more familiar. This is a perfect example of this type of dub techno that does that. But yeah, very strong track and another strong 7.5 for track number 3 called Orbit. Let's go into Particles. So that was the track called Particles. Nice taut beat, nice and nice builder track of energy. This is the kind of track you like to mix. One strong, kind of one more main track, and this is kind of a great builder into another track when you're DJing. I call this kind of an in-betweener track because it's very minimal and for the most part it's straightforward, but it can build two tracks really around it really well as you're sort of creating a flow on a DJ set. That's kind of what I call a transition track or a builder. It kind of builds to another track that can be a peak or a change pace. Um, I really like the how the chords sort of synchronize themselves in this. You have a feeling of things kind of are loose but kind of coming together. Creative rhythms make for unique cycles in dub techno. I always say that a lot. Like if you have a different kind of rhythm, it gives you the opportunity to create different movements and what I call cycles in sort of the things that are repeating inside of different measures and structures within the track. So this one does a good job of that. I like how things get serious with the new dominating chord that gets introduced. That's really nice, and everything pretty much after that becomes kind of secondary, and it's kind of got a good balance and just overall a really good track. And I give it a 6.25 stars. Not quite to the level of the other three tracks, but this is sort of a builder track, and it has its uses, and it's pretty much straightforward, but it still has that feeling that it can grow on you as well. But on first listen, I give it 6.25 stars for track number 4 called Particles. Let's go on to track number 5 called Float. Alright, so that was track number 5 called Float. Like the title says, it certainly has a very feeling of floating ambient with kind of drifts of sort of gravity influenced sounds and just that feeling of flight. It's a nice break in the album. I like the audio transmission sounds in there and atmosphere the album that the song creates. I do think the song is a little bit long. Although I love ambient sort of interludes that begin an album, or maybe it's an outro at the end of the album. And here it's in the middle, which I like as well. But running roughly 8 or 9 minutes, it's a little bit long, but generally if it's a good track, more of it's welcomed, and this is certainly a good track. So in that respect, it being longer is certainly fine with me and probably fine with anybody who listens to the album. But I think you can kind of get the same impact if it was 2 or 3 minutes, and in some ways it might be a little bit more. I wouldn't say creative, but maybe a little bit more. Um, I don't know. Maybe it would help the flow a little bit if it was a break and it was sort of a shorter break than really almost a longer break, because this track is fairly long. But that's just my opinion. I still think it's a good track, and I give it 6.25 stars for the track called Float. Let's go on to number 6 called Mass. That was track number 6 called Mass. You gotta love the intro. It just builds anticipation and rises to a break. This one's probably the most powerful deep bass line yet. Really like the. This one's a little bit more powerful, and I certainly like that in general. Again with the hook, like once again he makes a really strong hook off a couple different sounds, and it really adds to the catchiness of the track and really gives it a nice foundation. Very well produced. Love the melody swells. Um, Catchy chord work again, and then it sort of gathers itself, drops out, and then sort of comes back and rides on into the distance. And really a really nice flow to this one as well. Another strong track, 7.5 stars for track number 6 called Mass. Really good stuff. Really like this one. Let's go on to track number 7 called Heat. All right, that was the track called Heat, track number 7. Um, I really like the dubby, deep bass line on this one. You can certainly get lost in this track. It's very heady and atmospheric, and really almost hypnotizing in some ways. Really, really good production as well. I feel like this one has a little bit more of a warmer tone to it, just a little bit in the consistency and the chords. I do like this track a lot as well. I give it 6 3/4 stars. Another really good track though. A very very consistent album. A lot of times it's when making I mean an album as long as this, which is probably around 80 minutes, of 70 or 80 minutes, 10 tracks in all, is it's hard to make a very consistent strong album, and this album is certainly pacing that way. 7 tracks in, and nice balance of a lot of different styles and a lot of deep listening and really strong production. Just really, it's hard to keep this kind of quality up through this many tracks, and certainly this album's doing a good job of that. Let's go on to track number 8 called Elliptical. Track number 8 was called Elliptical. Hypnotizing stuff. This is definitely some stuff you can get lost in. That was track number 8 called Elliptical. Definitely some hypnotizing dub techno in here. Around 3 minutes, the chords become sort of almost dreamy, angelic, and the other parts sort of fade out, and that sort of becomes the focus, and it just kind of almost dreamy, angelic, kind of ringing out on those on those chords. It almost reminds me of like Juan Atkins' Starlight, like that track in sort of that way. You gotta love the sort of orchestral feel of those chords. It definitely gives me the vibes of like Wolfgang Voigt's like Koningsfort album, or certainly this almost in vein of Marcus Gunter's classic In Mol album from Compact, really back in 2001. This really reminds me of that. Also a little bit like Sending Orbs material as well, that label. Just the floaty chords, strong production, and those chords almost sounding orchestral as they swell. It just gives me that kind of Wolfgang Voigt, uh, sound, just classic dub techno sound on the more ambient side. Really strong track. I give it 7 3/4 track, 7 3/4. My favorite track so far. But it's very close with Inertia and Orbit and Mass. Those and Elliptical. Those 4 tracks are my 4 favorites so far. But there's two remaining, and let's go on to Object. right, that was track number 9 called Object. This is my favorite so far. This one nailed it. This is awesome. I love the crisp chords, the spaciousness, great pacing on this track as well. Love the rolling bass, magnificent balance of traditional dub percussion combined with a brilliant atmosphere. Love the second stanza in particular with the piano comes in. That's kind of the hook that sort of completes the really beautiful balance this has. Just a very gentle track and very atmospheric, ambient, but still tied into ambient dub and dub techno. Such a strong track and my favorite track of the album so far. I give it an 8.25 stars. Um, right into the classic mode. I think this is a future classic in many ways. Um, just the tones on the chords are just so perfect and so gentle, and it almost gives you that sort of feeling like you're floating on some kind of some raft in some beautiful tropical island. Even though this is still a little bit on the colder side of the production, it's not necessarily on the warmer side. Like those chords, that those the cadence and sort of tone on those and coloring on that on those chords really kind of give it that sort of reflective vibe that I look for a lot in in the ambient side of dub techno that I really love. Fantastic track. I really love this track. 8.25 stars again. Let's go on to the last track called Matter. All right, so that was the last track called Matter. Track number 10, another ambient track, so similar to Float. I do like this one a little bit better. It's a little bit more layered. Has a little bit of a crescendo in it. Almost feels like memories are flashing by. It kind of gives you that reflective, sort of nostalgic feel in it. Just really good production on this one. I give this one a 6.5 stars. And so, adding up the stars in total, I give there's 71 and a quarter stars divided by 10 tracks, so a 71 out of 100. I also gave the album a couple extra points. I think it's very consistent, very strong production, and for those, just for the overall quality and keeping it consistent and a well sussed album as well, and again strong production. So I give the album a 73 out of 100 in total. I think it's right almost in the middle of very good. Maybe a couple more kind of standout tracks would have got it more towards it being almost an immediate classic, but very strong album. Definitely kind of gives me that Marcus Gunter vibes of music like his, kind of on the more laid back, which I generally is a little bit more towards my liking because I am a big ambient fan, and ambient dub in general is one of my favorite genres, and dub techno is secondary to that love just by a little bit, but this album does a great job of sort of satisfying my likes and my personal style inside the the mix of the two genres is where I find a harmony at, and this album does a really good job of meeting both those styles of music. Just a really impressive album, really good stuff, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts on what you heard so far and what you would rate it as. Um, my favorite four tracks are Object, and then I think probably it's close. Probably Elliptical second, and then there's three tracks tied with a 7.5, and that's Inertia, Orbit, and Mass. I like all those three tracks. So again, five tracks that are above 7.5. So a really strong album in general. Just really consistent album. The only really critique I have is sometimes it's hard to listen, and this is just an overall observation, not really specifically about this album, but it's hard to devote 75, 80 minutes to an album. It is a lot. It's a hard to get through. The only thing I would suggest to the artists and people that do styles of this albums in this style, is if you're going to do ambient pieces, really decide whether you want to do them long or shorter. I think if track number 5 and 10 were 3 minutes, I think you could get the same impression and same influence and same uh, goal out of them as if they were 6 to 9 minute tracks. If they were around 3 minutes each, I think you'd save about 10 to 15 minutes in total on the album, and it would be more reasonable expectation for somebody to get through an album in less than an hour versus 75 minutes, almost up to 80 minutes is a long time for somebody to devote to one album. You know, these days it's really hard to sit down for 80 minutes and listen to one album. There's just so much good music out there, and and especially as a DJ, and if you have a lot of music, it's you could get a phone call and it distract you, and you really have to devote 80 minutes to this in full to listen to it. Generally around like 50 to 55, 60 is probably an ideal area for an album, but that's just a personal opinion, nothing against this album. That's just an overall thought on the time you can give to an album. Sometimes it can be hard to devote that much time to an album. But having said that, really strong album and really enjoyed it. That was my review on BT Gate X-138's Gravitational Grooves album on Grayscale, which is Grayscale's 44th full-length album now. Just a fantastic lineage of music the label is putting out. I'm going to put a link below to the album if you're interested in checking out more from the artist, or you'd like to purchase this album, there'll be a link down below so you can check out this artist and this album, and then more from Grayscale if you like. All right, thanks for joining me. I'm curious to know your opinions on the music below. Feel free to give me some feedback and what you think. What do you think about this album, and what do you think about the songs, and maybe what are your favorite song or two is from this album? I'll be curious to know. All right, thanks so much.
Electric Cafe.